monsoon humidity here, and I kind of enjoyed it this year. We missed monsoon last year. This year it's come, and I enjoy the humidity, even though I don't like humidity. But anyway, hope you're having a good day. The writer of this psalm was not having a good day, not by any stretch of the imagination. The psalm we look at today is Psalm 74. And it's another psalm by a man named Asaph. We don't know anything about him except that he was in the court. There is probably a court composer of some sort. This is a plea for God to arise and to defend His cause. This is a psalm very much like the Book of Lamentations and a few other psalms. This is a psalm that was written probably within a lifetime, or perhaps even soon after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem back in about 586 or 587 BC. It's hard for us to imagine exactly how horrifying that was. I mean, if you can perhaps imagine, how we all felt when the Twin Towers were knocked down, when the Pentagon was attacked, all these things that happened back in 2001, and a sense of horror that we felt when our symbols of finance or economics, our symbols of defense, and potentially our symbol of the seat of government were attacked in those days, and the tremendous loss that we felt in the way our whole world began to change. It was even more than that, because the people of Israel were, the destruction of the temple was just like the worst thing that could ever happen, and because it was a symbol of God's presence in their midst, and so it wasn't just the loss of their sovereignty and the attack of alien nation overcoming them, but the sense of, is God even with us anymore? And so here we see this psalm, which is quite a beautiful psalm. So let's take a look at it and see what we can learn from it. It divides rather comfortably. It's a fairly long psalm in three different sections. In the first section, we see the psalmist taking a survey of the ruins and basically kind of asking God to walk with him through the debris of the temple, and saying, and it really has the key words in it, the verses 1 through 11, of why and how long. Why has this happened, O Lord? And how long will we have to put up with this? But this is not the question of doubt, because there's also a sense in verses 12 to 17 where he's involved in what I call a reminder that God is king. In fact, it begins in verse 12 with the phrase, "Yet God is king." So we see him asking God to look at the ruins, why and how long. And then he reminds himself that God is in fact still king of the earth, and that though the temple is gone, God is not gone. Though the symbol of God's presence is destroyed, God himself is still among them. And so then finally, in verses 18 to 24, there is a plea for God to act. And the key words are remember and arise. So the key words of the first section, why? How long? Of the second section, yet God is king. And then finally of the third section, a plea for God to act, remember and arise. So let's take a look at this psalm, Psalm 74. Oh God, why do you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? Remember your congregation, which you have purchased of old, which you have redeemed to be the tribe of your heritage. Remember Mount Zion, where you have dwelt. Direct your steps to the perpetual ruins. The enemy has destroyed everything in this sanctuary. Begins with this really earnest and heartfelt plea. God, why have you let this happen to us? Why does your anger smoke against us? I imagine the smoke of the ruins there. We've seen smoke happening here in our beloved city here. Fortunately, this year we've had a relatively innocuous fire season as it relates to Cave Creek. But of course you remember last year when people we love had property burned because of fire. People had to evacuate their homes, and so this sense of loss. Remember, he says, your congregation, and he says, direct your steps toward their perpetual ruins. Now, come with me, Lord. Let's take a look around. He goes on in verse 4 and following. And look at the vivid descriptions. Your foes have roared in the midst of your meeting place. They set up their own signs for signs. They were like those who swing axes in the forest of trees. All its carved wood they broke down with hatchets and hammers. They set your sanctuary on fire. They profaned the dwelling place of your name. They said to themselves, we will utterly subdue them. They burned all the meeting places of God in the land. We do not see our signs. There is no longer any prophet. There is none among us who knows how long. How long, O God, is the foe to scoff? Is the enemy to revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the fold of your garment and destroy them. You see this earnest plea. God, why did this happen? How long will we have to do? God, do something. And then the tone of the psalm begins to change in the 12th verse when he reminds himself that despite how it looks, God is still king. It begins with this phrase, verse 12. Yet God my King is from old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. It's, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, even though the symbol of God's presence is gone, the temple is destroyed, still, that hasn't destroyed God. God is king, not just of Mount Zion, the place where the temple was set there on that mountain. He's not just there. They can kill the temple, they can destroy the temple, but they cannot destroy God. God is king in the midst of the earth. And now he recites their own history of God's acts of salvation on their behalf, especially the crossing of the Red Sea. Verse 13, you divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks. You dried up ever-flowing streams. A lot we could say about this. There's references even to other religious worship experiences showing that God is king even over every other religion. But let's go on. He goes on in verse 16, speaking about not just God as the king of Israel and over other nations, but rather God is the king of all creation. Yours is the day, verse 16. Yours also is the night. You have established the heavenly lights and the sun. You have fixed all the boundaries of the earth. You have made summer and winter. You see, he remembers God's salvific acts on their behalf when God showed he was king over Egypt and Pharaoh and brought them through the land, showing that he was a king not just of Israel but over all other kings, not just of the Red Sea but over all of nature, and we can trust in him. And so he comes back to, in the third section, another plea for God to act, but it's not got the same angry tone. It no longer asks how long and why. It simply calls on God to be faithful to his covenant. Verses 18 to 24. And here again, the key words are remember and arise. Verse 18. Remember this, O Lord, how the enemy scoffs and a foolish people reviles your name. Do not deliver the soul of your dove to the wild beasts. Do not forget the life of your poor forever. Have regard for the covenant, for the dark places of the land are full of the habitations of violence. Let not the downtrodden turn back in shame. Let the poor and needy praise your name. Arise, O God, defend your cause. Remember how the foolish scoff at you all the day. Do not forget the clamor of your foes, the uproar of those who rise against up continually. This call to remembrance is such an important theme because when God remembers, God acts. And this seems to have the picture of the people in Israel, in Judah, who were left behind, because what happened when the conqueror came in, they kept deporting people out and bringing them to Babylon. But they left the poor, they left the weak, they left the undesirables there in the land. And probably this psalm is written by or from the perspective of those who are still in the land. They're not the nobles. They're not eating well like they often were in Babylon. They're not planting houses and vineyards there in Babylon. They're just subsisting in the midst of the ruins of their lives. And so he says, Lord, remember how the enemy scoffs and a foolish people reviles your name. Do not forget the life of your poor forever. And the plea, have regard for the covenant. The psalmist comes back to the reality. God has chosen this people as his people. So remember your covenant and arise, he says, and defend your cause. Because see, even though, as I said, the temple has been destroyed, there's still the confidence that God is still present. The loss of that symbol is not the loss of their God. And you know, in our own lives, we can go through terrible loss, whether personal or with regard to businesses, various kinds of loss. And we too can say, God, how long? How long? Why? And then we remember that God, though he seems sometimes to be distant, is never far from us. God has shown his commitment to us. For them, it was the covenant which God had established them on the mountain of Sinai, and the salvation which God had given to them by bringing them out of Egypt. But for us, on this side of the Jesus story, we have the covenant made by Jesus when he said, a new covenant I will make with you. And we symbolize it with the bread and the cup when Jesus gave his life on the cross for our sin, his body broken, his blood spilled for us. And so whenever we suffer, whenever we don't understand, whenever we face hard times, we come to God, but we also remember that we serve a God who has embraced our condition, who suffered with us and in our place. So we say to the Lord, I will trust you even if I don't always understand you. And we plead with God that he would remember and act to do what needs to be done, saying always as Jesus himself said, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. So when all the things we trust in are torn from us, we realize that God is never far from us. Hopefully that encourages you. Remind us that people of all ages his feelings to you. He also reminded himself that God was king and that no matter what